For many people, that buzzing sound is enough to trigger panic. But bees aren't looking for trouble. They're out hunting nectar. The payoff from all their searching shows up as honey buns, honey nut Cheerios, honey barbecue, granola bars, and a whole lot more. None of that deliciousness happens without them. So stick around, because we're going inside the hive to show you exactly how they turn scattered drops of nectar into liquid gold. Known species of bees on the planet. And collectively, they pollinate roughly 75% of the fruits, vegetables, and nuts that sustain us. Without these insects, our entire agricultural system that billions of people depend on wouldn't exist. Yet across all 20,000, one species has contributed more to human agriculture than any other: the honeybee. For most of recorded history, getting to their honey was a chaotic and destructive process. Find a wild nest, subdue the colony with smoke, and raid whatever could be reached. Honey, wax, and brood, all of it tangled together. What came out was rarely clean, and the bees' colony was destroyed too. It stayed that way until 1851,
when Lorenzo Langstroth, an amateur naturalist, sought a less intrusive way to harvest honey without harming the bees.
While studying his hives, he noticed the bees always left a tiny 3/8-inch gap between their combs and any surrounding surface, just wide enough for them to pass or work back to back without touching. He coined that gap the bee space and designed an entire system around it called the Langstroth hive.
His design used removable wooden frames, spaced at exactly 3/8 of an inch apart.
So the bees would build straight and organized sheets of honeycomb only on the frames, which could be lifted cleanly out without destroying the colony.
Today, Langstroth hives remains the global standard in managed beekeeping, and commercially, dozens or even hundreds sit together on a single site called an apiary, where large-scale honey production begins. Inside each hive lives a colony of anywhere from 20,000 to 80,000 bees, functioning as a single coordinated organism.
The colonies are built around 3 types of bees: workers, drones, and one queen.
And on an apiary, these colonies are almost always assembled by beekeepers, rather than left to form on their own.
They all begin with the queen, whose primary role is to produce the next generation of workers and drones, and eventually her own replacement.
While in the wild, a colony will raise its own queen.
Then waits on her nuptial flight, where she mates mid-air with multiple drones from other colonies before returning home to spend the rest of her life laying eggs.
That pace is far too slow for commercial apiaries, so they take a much faster approach with what's called queen rearing and splitting.
In queen rearing, they breed queens from strong and productive colonies, favoring traits like high honey yield
and resistance to varroa mites. Then artificially mate those queens in advance.
Those pre-mated queens are then introduced into a nuke, or nucleus colony, which is a small starter hive with a handful of brood and about 10,000 workers.
With an instant workforce, the new queen begins laying immediately, up to 2,000 eggs per day. And within weeks, that small nuc has grown into a full-strength hive of up to 80,000. The rest of the hive is made up between drones and workers.
Drones are the males, and their only biological purpose is mating with queens from other colonies.
But since every queen on the apiary arrives already pre-mated, the drones have no real purpose to serve, so they just hang around the hive and eat honey.
Even though they don't contribute anything to daily hive operations, beekeepers tolerate them in small amounts, a few hundred at most.
Knowing the queen will still produce some regardless. And their total absence can act as a stress signal to the queen. Then there are the workers, which are all female. They make up the vast majority of every hive and handle every task that keeps it running and thriving. They nurse brood, produce wax, build and repair comb, defend the entrance, and in the later part of their lives, become foragers. Foragers leave the hive entirely, flying miles out in search of pollen to feed the colony and nectar, the raw ingredient they'll use to make honey. But they don't leave without knowing where to go first. A scout bee has already completed a reconnaissance flight. located some productive flower patches, and returned home to tell the colony exactly where to fly.
The scout shares the location through what's called a waggle dance. She walks in a straight line while vibrating her body and wagging her abdomen, then loops back and repeats it, over and over. The angle of the dance tells the other bees which direction to fly.
Relative to the sun. Straight upward on the honeycomb means fly towards the sun.
Left or right means adjust your course by that angle, and the longer the waggle, the farther away the flowers are. Now let's follow a foraging bee on that trip, and watch how she gathers pollen and nectar, then carries it back to the hive to become honey. After surviving all winter clustered deep inside the hive, vibrating their bodies to stay warm,
while steadily draining their honey reserves.
Springtime finally arrives, and their focus shifts from survival to replenishment. As temperatures climb above 55 degrees, the hive bursts into motion, and the new generation of foragers takes flight for the first time.
Guided by directions already mapped out by the scouting bee. A wild honeybee may travel up to 5 miles foraging for nectar,
Crossing forests, fields, and open countryside in search of whatever happens to be blooming.
Commercial honeybees have a much easier route because most apiaries are deliberately positioned directly beside large nectar sources,
like apple orchards, cherry groves, or almond farms, along with dense patches of clover and wildflower.
Once a forager lands on a flower, she extends her long, straw-like tongue called a proboscis and sips nectar from deep inside the bloom. A portion is burned immediately as fuel for flight, while the rest is stored inside a separate organ known as the honey stomach. Filling it completely can require nectar from more than 500 flowers in a single trip. As she moves from flower to flower, brushing against petals and stamens, pollen clings to the 3 million tiny branched hairs covering her body.
This powdery coating is more than just plant dust, though. It carries the male reproductive cells of the flower.
Without realizing it, she transfers pollen between plants as she feeds, fertilizing flowers with almost every
As the pollen builds up, she grooms it backwards into storage cavities on her hind legs, called corbiculi,
mixing it with small amounts of nectar and saliva to form dense yellow pellets.
When she's finally done, she lifts off, carrying a load roughly equal to her own body weight in nectar and pollen. And during the flight home, the process of turning that nectar into honey has already begun. Enzymes inside her honey stomach are actively breaking down the nectar's complex sugars, beginning the long process that will eventually turn the sweet liquid into honey.
Back at the hive entrance, she makes a landing, then pushes her way through the crowd and returns to the comb.
She starts by kicking the compact pollen pellets from her hind legs into an empty cell. Other workers move in quickly, using their heads to press the pellets down and pack them tight. They add a little saliva and a trace of honey, then leave the mixture to sit. Over roughly 10 days, that packed pollen undergoes lactic acid fermentation, slowly converting from raw powder into bee bread, the colony's primary protein source, which is used to feed developing larvae or hungry workers nearby. Then, attention shifts to the nectar. She regurgitates the nectar directly into the mouth of a waiting house bee, then heads back out for another foraging trip. That house bee holds the nectar in her own honey stomach for a time, adding a fresh round of enzymes, then passes it mouth to mouth to another bee, who does the same. Each transfer mixes the liquid and adds more enzymes, slowly changing its chemistry. When the nectar has been processed enough, the final bee in the chain pours the now thickened liquid into an open cell.
But it isn't honey yet. The solution is still too watery to store. So all the bees gather around the open cells and fan their wings
at 150 times a second, driving a current of warm air across the surface and evaporating out the moisture. After about 3 days of continuous fanning, the water content has dropped to between 17 and 20%. The liquid has thickened, stabilized, and has finally become honey. Only then do they seal each filled cell with a wax cap, turning it into a tiny storage jar that will sustain the colony throughout winter. Sadly, the foragers who started that chain won't be around when those cells are opened. After about 20 days of relentless foraging, the mileage catches up with her. Her wings fray and weaken beyond recovery, and her body follows.
At roughly 45 days old, she'll eventually leave the hive one final time, and never returns.
As summer begins to fade into autumn, the beekeeper knows it's time to check in on the hives.
They move through the apiary with a smoker in hand, sending controlled puffs of smoke across the entrances. The smoke masks their alarm pheromones and encourages the bees to retreat deeper into the hive, making it safer to open a lid.
A few heavy frames are lifted and checked for their pale wax caps, a clear sign the moisture is just right and the honey is ready to pull.
Instead of shaking or brushing each frame by hand, the beekeeper brings out a high-powered blower.
Strong jets of air sweep across the comb, pushing the bees down into the brood chambers below.
Within minutes, the upper boxes stand mostly free of bees, ready to be moved. The supers are lifted off in stacks.
Then, a forklift slides its forks underneath and loads them onto a flatbed truck, where they're strapped down for transport.
The full boxes pull out of the apiary and head toward the honey house, where everything those bees spent the season building finally comes out of the comb. Once the loaded supers reach the honey house, they're stacked high inside this enormous heated warehouse called the hot room. This area can store more than 20,000 supers at a time, and the entire room is kept near 100 degrees. Warming the honey and softening the comb so everything will run smoothly through the extraction line.
When it's time for extraction, a stack of supers is lifted by forklift to the start of the line.
The boxes are placed on this feed system that lifts the frames up and out from below. Then, a worker pushes them forward into the uncapper.
The frames move down past these heated and vibrating blades that shave away the thin wax caps covering the honey cells.
Those shaved cappings and residual honey fall into a catch basin below. We'll show you what happens to those in a moment. The uncapped frames convey straight into this centrifugal extractor. It's first packed with up to 100 frames at once. Then, it spins at 200 revolutions per minute, with centrifugal force throwing the honey out of the comb and against the outer walls, where it drains into a collecting sump. In a matter of minutes, most of the honey has left the comb entirely. The extracted honey, along with the wax honey mixture from the uncapper, are both pumped through heated pipelines into the separator. A spinning filter drum catches the heavier wax particles, which are later melted into 40-pound blocks and sold to other manufacturers for cosmetics, candles, and other wax-based products. The clarified honey moves on, flowing steadily toward the barreling area. Before it's stored, a sample of each batch is tested. Technicians check color and moisture content, then assign a grade that will determine how the honey is sold. Once graded, the raw honey is drawn off into color-coded 55-gallon drums, marked to identify the source farm, then staged for transport to the bottling plant, the last stop before it reaches the shelf. The drums arrive at the bottling plant by truck, where they're quickly unloaded and moved indoors. They're organized across the warehouse floor by color, with each one tagged and sorted by the apiaries and farms that supplied them. Before any of it moves to the line, a portion of the barrel's long enough to reliquefy the honey, so it pours cleanly out the drums. When the honey is loose again, the barrels are lifted out by forklift and carried over to this large melt tank and tipped in. It pours out looking pale and cloudy, because raw honey will turn this color as it crystallizes in the days after extraction. Inside the tank, the honey is brought up to roughly 180 degrees and held there for 24 hours. The sustained heat fully liquefies the crystals and carries any lingering flecks of wax or bee parts to the surface, where they're skimmed away and sent out for rendering. With the debris cleared, The liquefied honey runs through one final filtration to strip out any remaining microscopic particles. It then flows through a heat exchanger that steps the temperature down to around 120 degrees.
Still warm enough to move freely through the pipelines without resistance.
Ovens. At this point, technicians will blend in different harvests together in measured ratios, building specific color and flavor profiles.
Warm honey finally streams into the bottles. Caps are twisted on, and labels are applied. The filled bottles are boxed, loaded for delivery, and shipped out from the plant, ready to swirl into tea,
Glaze barbecue wings, or anything else that needs a touch of sweetness.
After seeing everything that goes on inside the hive, it's pretty wild to think a single bee produces only about a teaspoon of honey over her entire lifetime.
Millions of flower visits, thousands of miles in flight, and an entire colony working together non-stop just to fill a single jar. So how do you like to use honey? Drizzled, stirred, baked in? Share it with everyone in the comments.